Will you pray with me? Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Who died and made you God? It's an odd title for a sermon, I grant you. And you may have found it offensive when you read it or heard it. It is intended to be offensive. It's one of those playground taunts that children like to serve up to someone who's acting too high and mighty for their liking. Somebody who's trying to take over the process or call the shots or break the rules or at least bend them to their own benefit. Nobody knows where the expression came from, but everybody has probably used it, or wanted to, sometime or other. Basically, it is the question put to Job in the passage we heard just a moment ago, though not in so many words. After an avalanche of adversity had crashed down on Job, after his so-called friends had bombarded him with the worst excuse for consolation the world has ever seen, after his own agonizing efforts to make sense of his suffering had fallen far short of satisfaction, Job got the visit from God he had been demanding. And what did God say? That's right. Who died and made you God? Why would God challenge Job this way, after all Job had been through? After all that God had knowingly allowed Job to go through? Could it be that Job, consciously or unconsciously, had come to the conclusion that he could or would do a better job than God had at running the world that had run amok for him? For almost 40 chapters, Job had defended his innocence against all accusations. He had demanded justice over and over from the God who alone could give it to him. And God's answer, in the end, is simply, let's be clear about which one of us is God. And God could say the same thing to many in our world today. For many in our modern world have decided that God has died, or simply does not exist, which means that anybody who wants to can be God. This is the thrust of the growing secular mindset of our culture. Though Christians have pushed back on this perspective, see for instance the recent movie God's Not Dead, the mindset that more and more have assumed that God does not exist is an outgrowth of ideas put forward in the 1960s by radical theologians and picked up by popular media like Time magazine, who asked on an ominous cover in 1965, "Is God dead?" Those who asked the question assumed the answer to be yes. And that possibility became popular with people who did not want to be constrained by a code of right and wrong established and therefore enforced by a supreme authority whose will could not be contested. The sense that if there is no God, all things are permissible. Now that's an idea attributed to several famous authors, including C.S. Lewis. We live in an increasingly permissive society because vast numbers of people have embraced the belief that there is no God, or at least not one who could hold anybody accountable or punish anyone for any personal activity. Who died? God died, or so they think. And if God is dead, you can make yourself God. God of as much as you can control, whoever you are. We live in a world where many, many people are making themselves God of as much as they can. They do what they want to do, whatever the circumstances, whatever the consequences. They take what they want, regardless of whom it actually belongs to. They don't do what they should do, because they don't want to, and expect others to make up the difference, which is less and less likely to happen as more and more people make themselves God. Multiply it 1,000,000 times, And then imagine what the result will be when everybody makes himself or herself God. Or don't imagine it. Just look around. Of course, not everybody who has been made God will have to answer me when asked, who made you God? Because God has died, as far as many people are concerned. Some people have figured out that they can be God of more than themselves if they have the money to buy more power, or the celebrity to claim more influence, or the political clout to be elected or appointed to more authority. If you can get people to make you God over other people, then you will get a real sense of what gods can do. And if, in those high places of power, you do not have to submit to a higher power, a supreme divine power like a real God, what you are permitted to do will seem and perhaps be unlimited. You can alter the lives of countless millions and undermine the moral foundations of great nations. And more, we see what it looks like for people to act as though they are God. Those with no real power are pathetic in their immoral posturing. Those with great power imperil us all with their hubris. Job had a good reason to wonder if God had died. He called out to his God over and over, and his God did not come. God did not reveal himself to Job or answer Job in his distress until the end. In the end, it became clear that God was not dead. Nor had he delegated his divinity to Job or any other human being who might have wanted to take God's place. Throughout the book, Job had been demanding answers from God. When God appears to Job, it is God who asks the questions. Today, many have decided, consciously or otherwise, that there is no God in any practical sense, and any book of Revelation claiming to be from this God or about this God can safely be ignored. It's all a bunch of outdated superstitions, legends, and mythology, they smugly conclude. And everyone does what is right in his or her own eyes. Again. But suppose, contrary to popular opinion, that God is not dead. A newspaper once told all its readers that Mark Twain had died. In response, the quite healthy humorist wrote, "The report of my death was an exaggeration." Is the report of God's death not also an exaggeration? So exaggerated as to be totally untrue. Billy Graham has said, "I know that God is alive because I spoke with him this morning." The Apostle Paul says, "What can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking. And their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools." We have the most educated society the world has ever seen. Our understanding of astronomy, geology, biology, and psychology are infinitely greater than what was known in biblical times. The taken for granted technical gizmos of our day would have seemed like inexplicable, spectacular magic 100 years ago, much less 1,000 years ago. Or 3. And yet, claiming to be wise, we have become fools if we claim that God is dead and think that we can put ourselves or anybody else in his place. Twice fools. First, for thinking God could die or that he never existed, while everything else, including us, exists and continues to do so. Second, for assuming that in the absence of an eternal, omnipotent, omniscient God, infinite in love and grace, any one or combination of us small, sad mortals could keep the world running without running it off the rails. Have you an arm like God? Can you thunder with a voice like His? God asks Job. And us? Not hardly. So why is everybody so determined to do away with God these days? Perhaps the answer to that question is contained in another question that God puts to Job. Will you condemn me, God, that you may be right? If there is a God, a real, true, honest to God God, nobody else gets to be God. Period. End of discussion. And if this real God has put out the final word on right and wrong, and it's one size fits all, and you're out of step with God's moral cadence, you've got to skip to get in step, or face God's wrath for marching to the beat of a different drummer. Claiming to be wise, we become fools. The Supreme Court can create laws, for instance, but it cannot make them moral if they violate the moral code of God. The stars of Hollywood can fill our TVs and movie screens with their darkness and debauchery, but one day they will all answer for their behavior before the God who filled the universe with real stars. We trade spiritual faith for secular sophistication and think that the apparent absence of God is evidence that we don't need God because we are able to do God's job ourselves. God is not absent, though He may be unseen. God is not dead, because He was and is and ever will be. God is not dead, and we are not gods. We are not gods because God is God. Only He is God, and He is the only God. No matter how many people try to make themselves or anyone else God instead. You cannot make anybody else God, no matter how often and how low you bow down before that person. And you cannot make yourself God, no matter how often or how flagrantly you ignore and violate God's law. In the end, God appeared to Job. In the end, if not before, God will appear to every one of us. If you don't like the way God has guided things in your life, you'll have the chance to tell Him so. But be careful there. A lot of what we think has gone wrong in our lives is our fault, not God's. We do more damage to ourselves and others by competing with God for the role of God than He does while guiding our lives through all of history and creation. And if God allows our suffering here, know that those who acknowledge His lordship here will receive crowns and thrones in heaven surrounding His throne, not as those who tried to make themselves gods, but as the disciples of the God who became like us and suffered for us, so that we might reign in heaven forever with Him. Who died and made you God? Nobody. Who died and made you God's beloved and redeemed child? Now that's a very different question with a very different and wonderful answer. The God who was dead on the cross and in the tomb and is now alive forevermore.